And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your marine weather outlook. On this Monday, July 31st, starting out with the sea ice. The ice has retreated up to the far northern regions out of the Chukchi Sea up toward the Arctic Ocean. And within this area, water's quite open now through the middle lower Chukchi Sea, including Norton Sound, or rather Kotzebue Sound, and then areas out along the northern Arctic coast here. Utqiagvik still has some ice in vicinity, and areas are much more open as you get toward Kaktovik to the east and north as a result of the warmer flow of water out of the Mackenzie River. For the upcoming forecast period here for tomorrow, Tuesday and Wednesday, starting out with this Monday afternoon, we have weak high pressure, lower Gulf, North Pacific, extending ridge out over Bristol Bay, all the way along the west side of the state up into a weak high north of the Arctic coast. Thermal low remains northwest Canada back into areas of the mainland. And then notable low, next feature is low pressure out in the western Aleutians with an occluded front that'll work its way eastward on Tuesday. Otherwise, the low over the Gulf in North Pacific remains fairly stationary with the ridge extending up through Bristol Bay and into the southwest interior. And on Wednesday, high pressure remains pretty much entrenched over the Gulf, North Pacific, back across the southwest mainland, and to a lesser extent here along the northwest coast. We have in this region, generally speaking, a mid and upper level high pressure that's going to keep the system off to the west, the low over the central Bering Sea, and the occluded front will not make much progress eastward, at least toward the interior, but it will butt up along the southwest and west coast here as we go through midweek. As far as winds for the inner channels, look for kind of a mixed bag of winds around 10 knots with waves running a couple of feet there in Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, and down toward Dixon Entrance. Otherwise, winds will generally be northwesterly, 5 to 10 knots along the outer coast with waves of 4 feet, and look for west-northwest winds outside of Yakutat Bay with waves also around 4 feet. For Wednesday, winds variable to northwesterly, 5 to 10 knots, waves continuing around a foot or two for the inner channels. Winds off of the coast there will be northwest to north at 10 knots, turning more easterly there once you get west of Yakutat Bay and toward Cape Suckling. Waves generally just a few feet. Keep in mind, high pressure is going to be sitting out toward the lower Gulf, North Pacific, so lighter winds here off the Kenai, variable around 10 knots, as well as within Prince William Sound and the middle and upper portions of Cook Inlet. Waves generally a foot or two with west to southwest winds 15 knots there at the entrance of Cook Inlet. And then on Wednesday with this pattern, variable winds across the region only around 10 knots, waves generally a foot or two in most locations, so a rather quieter marine pattern in the summertime, midsummer. Along Kodiak Island, winds will be south-southwest 15 knots, waves a couple of feet. Variable winds generally around 10 knots through the upper and middle portion of the Alaska Peninsula. Trying to turn southeasterly there, south of False Pass, waves generally just a foot or two. And on Wednesday, winds continue southwesterly 15 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, waves 2 to 3 feet, variable through the upper middle portion of the Alaska Peninsula around 10 knots, but we expect winds to pick up southeasterly 20 to 25 knots as that occluded front approaches from the eastern Aleutians. Now on Tuesday, the Aleutian chain will see southeasterly winds anywhere from 25 to 30 knots, eastern Aleutians, and then south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, central and western Aleutians. For Wednesday, look for winds to try to turn more south-southwesterly as we get west of Dutch Harbor in through Nikolsky, though winds 25 knots out of the southeast and south across the eastern Aleutians, turning southwesterly, especially west of Nikolsky through Atka and back west of Adak. And waves generally running 5 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side and 4 to 5 feet on the Bering side. For the southwest coast, variable winds, Bristol Bay, 10 knots, waves a foot or so. South winds 10 to 15 knots from Kuskokwim Bay along through Etolan Strait, lower Yukon Delta, Norton Sound with waves 2 to 3 feet. Southeast winds 20 knots, St. Matthew down through St. Paul with waves 5 to 6 feet. And on Wednesday, can see the hints of that occluded front working. It's approaching St. Matthew, St. Paul. Southeast winds to 25 knots, waves 7 to 8 feet. Still variable winds 10 knots within Bristol Bay thanks to that stubborn ridge of high pressure. South winds in the Kuskokwim Bay 15 to 20 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet. And then more of an east-southeast offshore flow out of Norton Sound and off of the lower Yukon Delta with waves running a couple of feet. So for areas of the lower Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, south winds 15 knots, as high as 25 knots there just to the west of Cape Lisburne. And then as we go along the Arctic coast, east-southeast winds 10 to 15 knots with waves 2 to 3 feet where there is open water. And on Wednesday, kind of a mixed bag of winds through the lower Chukchi Sea, 5 to 10 knots, waves just a foot or two. Look for southeast winds 15 knots, north side of St. Lawrence Island and on the west side of the Seward Peninsula. Back here along the Arctic coast, Wainwright, Point Lay, up to Utqiagvik, southwest winds about 20 knots with waves 3 to 4 feet. Turning westerly 10 knots there north of Prudhoe Bay, and then southerly winds around 10 knots with 2-foot waves in the vicinity of Kaktovik.